Well, good evening. Thank you very much for joining us for this IEA Book Club webinar. My name's Mark Littlewood. I'm the Director General here at the Institute of Economic Affairs. And before I hand over to this evening's chairman and our guest, I just want to go through a couple of adverts and a couple of housekeeping rules about how today's webinar will work. Firstly, if you wish to ask a question, you don't need to wait until the presentation is over. If you are watching us on Zoom, you should see at the bottom of your Zoom box that if you hover your cursor towards the bottom, you'll see a range of options, one of which is Q&A. And if you click on that box and type in your question, whenever it pops into your head, if it pops into your head after you've heard the first sentence from our speaker, feel free to ask your question then, but please type in your questions in Q&A if you're with us on Zoom, not in the chat box. Similarly, whether you ask a question or not, you'll be able to help our chairman this evening, because in that Q&A box, you will see where all the questions are listed, that there's a little thumbs up icon under each question. Please vote up your favorite questions. That will allow our chairman to exercise some sort of degree of democratic participation when it comes to him selecting what to put to our speaker. Please use the chat box as opposed to the Q&A if you have any technical problems or difficulties, or if you want to share links with your fellow attendees. So that's a little about how the webinar will work. If you're watching us on the YouTube stream rather than on Zoom and you've got a question, please just type that in the live chat box. We do have IEA staff monitoring that box, and they will cut and paste your question over to Zoom. So that's how the questions and answers will work when we get to them in around about half an hour's time. Also a bit of advertorial. If you are watching us on YouTube, please click the subscribe option at in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen and hit the notification bell. If you're watching us on Zoom and you don't know where our YouTube page is, you can find it on YouTube under IEA London. Similarly, please visit our website, iea.org.uk, where you can sign up for our daily email newsletter for free. And you can find out more about the IEA Book Club as well, which hosts a whole load of events, virtual at the moment, obviously, just like this one. So thanks again for joining us. I'm going to hand over to our distinguished chairman and curator this evening. A very good friend of mine personally, and of the IEA and the freedom movement more generally. Dan Hannan is formerly the Conservative Member of Parliament, member of the European Parliament for the Southeast of England. He has the great distinction of having spent much of his career trying to make himself redundant, not only a noble objective, but one that he has successfully accomplished. Dan is also an ardent free trader, free marketeer, and has been involved in a whole range of initiatives for free trade, is presently the president of the Initiative for Free Trade. So, Dan, it's absolutely fantastic to have you with us this evening. I know you're going to introduce our speaker and the theme, so please give a very large virtual round of applause for our chairman this evening, Dan Hannan. Dan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mark, and it's always a pleasure to see you, and always a pleasure to be on this platform with the UK's oldest and most distinguished free market think tank, irritating mercantilists, protectionists, leftists, and crackpots of every stripe ever since 1956. And the work of free market and pro-liberty organizations has never mattered more than now, as we wrestle with unprecedented expansions, not only in public spending, but more generally in the coercive power of the state. We're here to talk to one of my favorite economists. I think we can fairly say the leading free market economist in Spain, Daniel Lacalle. Daniel is a commentator and author. He's written very widely in English and in Spanish. He appears regularly on British, American, and Spanish media as an economic commentator. But he's really my favorite kind of economist because he's one of that fairly rare breed of economists who act on their own advice. And he's been a successful fund manager rather than simply someone who lectures others. Daniel has written a new book, Freedom or Equality. And Danielle, I would like to, I'd like to begin with you and your book. Why did you write it in the first place? And to do that, I need to, I suppose, remind the audience that there was a world before all this. This is like one of those moments in some post-apocalyptic drama where people talk about the world before, but there was a world before when we could enjoy our own property and travel freely and engage in market transactions. And when we had, how we miss them now, quotidian workaday arguments about the role of the state and the role of the market. And I suppose really that the first question that I'd like to put to you, Danielle, is why now? I mean, you conceived and executed this project before the first infections had been reported in China. I want to come on to the ways in which some of your arguments have become peculiarly apt and apposite in the world of the lockdown. But let's just go back and ask, what made you pick this moment to write a book extolling capitalism and personal liberty? I just want to check if are we seeing, yes, Daniel, are we seeing you?
I can see that Daniel is back
Yep.
in the chat. Daniel, are you there? He's just popped up on our screen, so he should be with us.
Daniel, did you catch my question there? Can you hear us now?
I did catch your question.
Very good.
There has been a small technical problem. Really sorry about that. But I was able to catch your question. Why did I write this book? In the past 4 years, we have seen a massive improvement in the well-being of humanity. 2019 was the best year for humanity. We have seen an unprecedented reduction of poverty in the last decade, an unprecedented improvement in terms of healthcare, in terms of access to education, in terms of so many of the things that we care so much about. In that same period, the rhetoric and the conversation, particularly in the media, has been driven towards how everything was worse and worse, and that the problem of the economy, of society, was inequality. With so many things that we had to celebrate and so many things that we needed to cherish, of everything that had been achieved globally in emerging markets, in developed economies, and with all the challenges, obviously, of the economy, the entire debate was about the absolutely impossible problem of inequality and how the solution had to come only from more government intervention, more taxation, all levels of interventionist measures and magic solutions. So the reason why I decided to write the book was first to give the average reader arguments to debate those issues in a normal conversation, to provide information, data, and reality, so that this dogma and this propaganda was at least debunked in a way in which.
Let me just ask you about that point specifically, Danielle. So you're right, of course, and you're not the only person to observe that actually globally inequality is falling and wealth is rising. But talk us through, is your argument that inequality doesn't matter as long as absolute wealth is rising? Is it that, in fact, inequality is falling anyway, so who cares? Or is it that inequality is a bad thing, but the market is a surer method of reducing it than state action.
Absolutely. The point that I make in the book is there are two types of inequality. There is what I call mimic inequality, which is actually good. It means that when I am surrounded by friends and surrounded by colleagues, and some of them are doing better than I am doing because of hard work and their achievement, that leads me to want to do better as well. Mimic inequality is actually something that is part of progress, and being able to see how through hard work and with innovation and talent, you're able to achieve more and better things than others. That is actually something that is positive. And there is bad inequality. There is inequality that is created because of a level of connection to the government or because of cronyism. And one of the things that I mentioned in the book is that in any case, the what you achieve, the way in which you achieve equality is through prosperity. Therefore, our objective as a society cannot be on something that is an outcome, equality, but the means to get there. And the means to get there are better employment, more innovation, higher prosperity, better allocation of capital. Right. Those are the main factors that I mention in the book.
And you talk a lot about how, I suppose you're tackling this idea that a lot of people have, and that we've seen, particularly in the last 2 months, where a surprising chunk of the population seems to think of the economy as an abstraction.
Yeah.
How many times in Britain, as in Spain, as in every country experiencing the viral infections, have you heard people saying, we have to put lives before the economy? We have to put people before profit, as though the economy could somehow exist other than for and through people, as if profits had some numinous disembodied existence outside human activity. And it's amazing how many people out there think that people like you and me, free marketeers, derive some kind of weird pleasure from watching graphs of GDP ticking up, as though that's why we're doing this, rather than, of course, the economy being the name that we give to the interactions that people can freely make to better their health and wealth and welfare.
Absolutely. I think that in this propaganda machine that we are subject to, one of the things that we hear constantly is a message that things cannot get any worse. And as such, the idea that more intervention, that more like
hang on. I don't know if it's me. I can't. I've lost the sound. Is that just me?
Yes, Daniel. We appear to have lost your sound. So if you can just hold on one moment while we try and get the sound back, I'll get our technical team on that right away. Dan H.
So just while you're getting that back, I wonder whether I could make another observation about the way in which the crisis of the virus is, if you like, making life a little bit harder for free market, limited government types like us. And it's something that's well attested and has for a long time been observed by behavioral psychologists. When people feel under threat, they become more tribal, more authoritarian, more introverted, more intolerant of dissent. They become, in political terms, more statist, more mercantilist. We hear people who were previously fairly reliable free market types saying things like, this crisis shows we need to produce our own food, or produce our own vaccines, or produce our own face masks, and so on. And those arguments, it seems to me, have a stronger appeal at a time like this than they would have in normal times, because the fear of a pathogen flicks switches in our brains. It makes us, if you like, more illiberal. Are you back online, Daniel?
I am back online.
Yeah.
You're
Very good.
right. Sorry, it looks like some interventionist force is trying to make it impossible for us to.
It's very simple. It's that you have a socialist communist government in Spain, so I expect regular power, regular apagones until you manage to change the people in charge. But you were talking about how market capitalism improves people's lives, and I just wanted to draw you on a theme in your book, because you give it the name social capitalism, which I thought was interesting. A lot of people watching will have heard the phrase, maybe used the phrase weasel words, without really knowing what it means. I find a lot of people use it just to mean untruth, but weasel word has a very specific meaning in English. There was a myth, we trace it back, as with most things, to one of Shakespeare's poems, where a weasel was supposed to suck the yolk out of an egg, but leave the shell. Yeah. So a weasel word is a word that, when you put it next to another word, drains the other word of all meaning. And Hayek observed that social was the ultimate weasel word, because when you put the word social next to any other word, you drain any meaning that word has when it's unadorned, as in social market, social justice, social democracy, social studies, social worker, etc. Now, you are bravely resuscitating it with social capitalism. So talk us through what social capitalism means.
Well, it's the reason why it is not a weasel word, as you were mentioning just right now, is because capitalism is the ultimate social system. And as such, what I wanted absolutely to do was to engage the reader and the majority of people in the conversation of giving back the word social where it belongs. This is what I think is critical, because, as you very well say, what we hear right now is adding the word social to justice to create injustice. Where we are using the word social to pervert the meaning, the true meaning of what something that is social is. What is social capitalism relative to what people perceive that capitalism is right now? Is capitalism devoid of cronyism? That is critical. This is the part that I'm talking about throughout the book, is that when many of the readers, many of the people that follow social media, again, weasel word, say that these problems of capitalism, these are the traits of capitalism. The majority of the traits of capitalism that they are talking about are traits of statism, are traits of massive government intervention, massive government decisions picking winners and losers, and huge central bank intervention. That is why, for me, it was almost like not just a challenge, but something that I wanted to do was to remind the reader. This is a book for somebody that wants to learn about economy and about policy without having to go into enormous levels of detail and academic research, although we give links to everything. But to me, it is absolutely critical that we recover the word social for what it is, for what it means.
I mean, one of the things that is very interesting to me, and I think, by the way you describe your book is very accurate and very fair. It's a very good way of putting ammunition into the hands of people who want to be able to make a good argument for liberty. And one such argument is, it's really more the tackling of a myth or a caricature than anything else. But I think that a lot of people, we will all have friends who are on the left, decent, well-meaning people who are absolutely convinced that if you are a free marketeer, if you're a capitalist, what they would call a neoliberal, it's because you believe in a selfish, atomized society where nobody cares about anyone else, where greed matters more than human relations and so on. And in a way, when you're talking about recapturing the word social, you're making the basic point that nothing interconnects us more than the market. That if I'm buying something from you or selling something to you, the two of us are then part of an incredible web of interdependence. Whereas if you had the misfortune of living in a truly socialist society, you find that a common theme in almost all of them was the removal of that space between the state and the individual. So the Bela Kun, who was to go on to be the communist leader of Hungary, he had the task after the communist coup in Hungary at the end of the 1940s of closing down every club, every society, every free institution. He closed down some 1,300 independent organizations, women's institutes, churches, Boy Scout groups, tennis clubs, the works. And this is the real paradox, that if you want a truly antisocial system that isolates everybody and then turns the interrogator's spotlight on them, socialism is that system.
Absolutely. That is, and that I think is something that we need to recover in the conversation and in the dialogue with not just the left, but with the average citizen. The idea that free market and capitalism are sort of systems created or based on greed makes absolutely no sense. It's completely farcical. The reality is that capitalism and free markets cannot exist unless there is a mutual benefit that is long-lasting and that is proven throughout time, that benefits the vast majority of society. The reality of capitalism is that what the free market does is exactly what the government intervention and control from central planners simply cannot do, which is the only system that is as close to the reality of what society is as can be. Why? Because it puts together the different objectives, the different resources, and the different needs of very, very different economic agents, and generates the best possible result out of the interaction between them. That is impossible to achieve through central planning. That's why what I say in the book is that governments can only equalize down. And the idea that central planning is going to change all of that and that is going to generate a society in which everybody is equal and everybody receives the same amount of wealth is only predicated on the reality that the only way in which governments can do that is by making everybody poor, not by making people richer. And the thought of assuming that individual activity, that innovation and and merit are equal to greed comes from the idea that if you don't believe in and you don't adhere to what central planners tell you to do, then you are greedy. You see, because the way that socialism works, is that when it delivers what it always delivers, which is poverty and misery, and people complain, then you implement repression because you're being a greedy bastard that does not want what the government is so generously giving you, which is nothing.
It's extraordinary, isn't it, how the semantic shift, the shift in our language, the way in which we use that word greed. Greed is always used in politics to mean wanting to keep your own stuff. It is never used to mean wanting to be given someone else's stuff, which that's called compassion. But I just want to remind people watching on Zoom or on YouTube to keep the questions coming in. We've got some great questions, which I'm going to come on to in a second. Do upvote the ones that you want me to put first. But just before I come to them, one of the things that you write about is the impact of inflation, of money printing. And I think there is to put it mildly, a strong possibility that there is now going to be a lot of, well, we've seen already massive money printing, huge injections of capital by almost every government over the past 2 months. In fact, you'll correct me if this is wrong, but my very rough reading of the stock exchanges is that they recovered by almost exactly the same amount that has been injected into the system. Now, why is that a problem? Just explain to the non-economists watching what is wrong with governments dealing with a crisis of this kind by printing more money.
Well, the first problem is that money creation, artificial money creation, is never neutral. And politicians, and particularly interventionist politicians, will always try to tell you that it's neutral. They inject money in the economy. It is evenly spread. Therefore, everybody benefits from from higher levels of liquidity. That is completely false. Money, artificial money creation is never neutral. It always massively benefits the first recipients of money, which are governments and the very indebted sectors close to the government, and it massively impacts negatively real wages and salaries and the savings of the average citizen. So it's so interesting that the same people that complain about the rise of inequality are the ones that defend massive money printing. And the reason why that makes no sense to anybody that understands that money printing is never neutral and always benefits the first recipients more, is that those same people, what they are looking for is not better equality or better prosperity, but higher control from governments, because ultimately that's what it does. Ultimately, what you're going to achieve through money printing is that the state will have an inordinate level of liquidity at a price that the private sector is not going to be able to finance itself. Therefore, it's unfair competition at the extreme. But even if you take away the problem of unfair competition in terms of capital allocation, the other element that to me is absolutely critical is to understand what money is that money is just a representation of the goods, services, and credit that exist in the economy. Therefore, if you print more money, the only thing that you're doing is passing the bill to the next generations. You're not generating more wealth, you're not generating better growth, you're basically just passing the bill of the imbalances that you're building right now to the future. So it is the most anti-social policy that you can imagine, because ultimately you don't achieve anything. Okay,
so trying to get out of this through massive money printing is going to hurt the people that the left purports to care about, as well as hurting everybody else. Mm-hmm. So what are the alternatives? I mean, the obvious ones that are being put forward now as alternatives to inflation as a way of getting out of the tens, hundreds of billions that we've been racking up in the last few weeks are either tax rises or borrowing. Now, talk us through what would be the impact of those.
Okay, we can all understand that governments at a time of crisis may be able to borrow more, because in the future they are going to then repay that debt with higher growth and higher levels of savings in the economy, basically. No? Think about this. When people say that there's only three options, no? They say, 1, the government borrows a lot. 2, we massively increase taxes. 3, we print money like there's no tomorrow. In reality, what they're saying is the same. They're telling you it is only one option, which is higher taxes or more wealth and prosperity cuts in the future. That's what they're telling you. That is, those are the options that they're putting in front of you. Obviously, when they talk about taxes, they say that it's taxes only on the rich, which is a ridiculous concept that should be debunked by now, because they always end up being taxes for everyone. But what can be done? Okay, you borrow now because there is a health situation that is leading the government to take extraordinary measures. That's fine, absolutely. In fact, the governments have a level of fiscal space that is unequaled. As such, they can use it. What they should do afterwards is the situation. What they should do afterwards is actually reduce taxes in order to let the economy heal, to let the businesses come back and generate further jobs, more growth, and more productivity, a key concept that people tend to forget in these environments. And then start to reduce spending, prioritize. I just don't understand this concept that we're hearing all over the Eurozone, that in which governments are saying, oh, here is the bill for the COVID-19 crisis. And on top of that, we continue to have the same budget that we had when we were expecting 2% per annum.
Well,
growth.
okay, but the problem surely is that is, although it may be an illogical, indeed an absurd reaction, it is a very popular one.
Yeah.
If our economy has fallen by 25%, you would not want to be the politician who argued that every public sector worker should therefore take a 25% pay cut. And the public mood at the moment, I think, I don't think people have begun to understand the long-term impact of the spending that we've had over the last 7 or 8 weeks. I think the idea that the money has run out, people are not going to want to hear that. The mood is still give our healthcare workers a pay rise, what heroes, right? So how in a democracy can you possibly win the argument at a time like this for fiscal restraint?
Well, first, treating citizens like adults. If you tell citizens that there's no problem of money and the only thing that you need to do is print it, like we hear from the MMT people and Mr. Corbyn, etc. If you tell people that Father Christmas exists, then they're going to think, okay, well, then there's no problem. Then what Dan and Daniel are saying is nonsense. It's just a question of printing money. But if you tell people the reality, which is, okay, if we do those things, print masses of amounts of money, plus continue to spend like there's no tomorrow in government spending, plus increase taxes, what you're actually doing is impoverish all of the private sector to benefit the public sector. Do you have to pay more to nurses and doctors? Maybe. Then maybe you have to prioritize and not pay as much to staff at ministries or to, I don't know, advisors. I don't know.
Yeah.
You need to prioritize. That's why it's called a budget. A budget is not called a budget because it's an unlimited figure that the government decides. A budget is called a budget because it is the decision to spend wisely and effectively the money that taxpayers give you for a service. So it's upside down economics. What people are defending right now is upside down economics. Is the government says how much it needs to spend and the rest of the economy has to adapt to it.
Yes, you and I share a first name, of course. And the original Daniel, the Old Testament Daniel, has always struck me as quite a good sort of fiscal conservative. You remember the story? He's called into Belshazzar's feast, and he sees an overextended state, and he sees all the precious metals, and his message is a pretty gloomy one. God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Thou art weighed in the balances and art found wanting. And that it has fallen to you, the Daniel of this generation, to be giving that unpopular message. I'm going to turn to some of the questions that we've been getting online. And being a great believer in democracy, I'm going to go, even though it's anonymous, to the one that has so far had the most votes. And it's the question is, what is the liberal answer to the problem of the left behind regions? You know, those that are not doing well out of globalization and free trade. You have them in Spain, we have them in the UK. Every advanced economy will have regions that are suffering during transition. And in the spirit of having the grown-up conversation that you were just talking about, how do you say to the unemployed Asturian miner or the unemployed, Sheffield steel worker, that it's all worth it in the long run, that his grandchildren are going to be much better off.
Okay, how do you deal with the left behind regions? With more interaction. Not the problem of the left behind regions. I have lived in the United States, in the UK, and in Spain, and the left behind regions tend to be left behind regions precisely because of the excessive decision to overprotect those regions through subsidies. No, you look at Andalusia in the southern part of Spain. The reason why it's not because of lack of talent. It's because it's so massively crowded with huge subsidies that those perpetuate poverty. Okay, so the way in which you make those regions grow is actually the example that we saw, for example, in the UK, when you saw this absolutely fabulous rise of the northern part of Great Britain that was, I remember Henry Kissinger saying that it was bound to steal or beg, no? And you've seen a dramatic change in those regions. You go anywhere now and you see now how they have developed, how they have a thriving economy, how they have developed completely different productive capacity models. All of those things can be achieved through higher level of interaction and more interconnection. What you don't achieve is, imagine for a second, the person or the people that ask that question, just think for a second, if the northern regions of the UK had been subject to the massive subsidies that they were subject to in the late 70s, where would they be today? Exactly in the same place as the southern part of Spain or the southern part of Italy. Therefore, with masses of unemployment, and they would not just be left behind, but they would be left behind of the future.
Yeah. I mean, you and I have both dabbled in politics. I was an elected politician for 20 years. And so this was a practical question for me. Now, I should say that the southeast of England was not an area which had suffered a lot of loss of industry. It had historically always been an area that was mainly services and high tech and light industry. But there were exceptions, of which the biggest was the old shipyards at Chatham in Kent, which employed about 10 or 12,000 people at peak. It closed in the mid-80s, just when all the steel mills and coal mines were closing. And of course, there were a lot of people who suffered and who were angry still. I mean, I would still come across guys who had lost their jobs. You know, if you're a skilled welder or whatever, and you lose your job in your 40s, and all you're going to get after that is work as a security guard, I mean, who wouldn't be angry in that position? I don't blame anyone for feeling bitter there. But it's important to tell the story right through to the end. Unemployment in that constituency, when I left office, the constituency that contained the old dockyards, was 1.2%. There were more people working there than there had been when it was a shipyard. What were they working in? There was a university there. There was some sort of industrial tourism and heritage stuff, but the biggest employer was the audiovisual sector. It was where they made Call the Midwife, where they made Sherlock, right? So the grandchildren of those guys who had been bashing metal for a living were tapping at a computer screen for a living. Does that take away the pain of the guy who loses his job? No, but it puts it in context, right? My maternal grandfather was a shipyard worker on the Clyde.
Yeah.
He had a very unhealthy, typical West of Scotland life. He smoked very heavily. He died when I think he was 60, 59, 60, so I never met him. So I never got the chance to ask him whether he would have wanted to have kept that shipyard going at any cost to the country as a whole. But I have a pretty shrewd idea that if he could see what my cousins and I are doing instead of what he did for a living, he wouldn't have an ounce of regret. Let me put you, we've got a couple of celebrity people putting questions online. So let me put to you a question, Danielle, from Neil Munnery, who is the author of a great book on how Hong Kong became the miraculous success story under the great Cowperthwaite, its financial secretary. I have just moved up the screen. Yes, I had it there. But he asks whether social capitalism inevitably becomes crony capitalism, social capitalism as you define it. Why does social capitalism usually turn into crony capitalism? Is it inevitable because of public choice economics? If free markets are almost impossible to maintain, isn't it then just a choice of which inefficiency you want?
It's a great question, and I think that it's very important to understand that it's not black or white. Obviously, capitalism is a system that is always judged by the worst of its outcomes, while socialism is always judged by the best of its intentions. The reality is that what we need to do is to improve the situation for everybody in an environment in which what you achieve is the access to the highest level of efficiency possible. Can there be misallocations of capital? Yes, of course. But when you have enough incentives to keep the system in its purest form, and where government works as what it should work, which is as the facilitator, not the decider of who wins and who loses, the risk of cronyism actually is much lower. And that is actually what we have seen in history, is that it's actually been much more effective. It is much more effective to have a capitalist system to reduce the risk of cronyism than to have a socialist system that will guarantee it.
Good. Another celebrity, sort of celebrity question from my former MEP colleague, now luminary at the IEA, Syed Kamal, and Ramadan Kareem to you, Syed. And Syed asks, state socialists believe that the solution is a top-down state taxing more and redistributing wealth to tackle poverty in a top-down trickle-down. But aren't free marketeers equally guilty in terms of economic growth leading to trickle-down growth? How do we make the case for bottom-up local libertarianism or community conservatism? In other words, well, I think you get the question, right? Are we guilty of thinking that if we create wealth that everyone benefits rather than dispersed trickle up?
Well, there's one thing that is absolutely clear, is that if you decide imagine that all of us together were the government and we had to decide how to redistribute wealth. We, with our best intentions, we would be wrong. We would be absolutely wrong. We would make a mistake. And we're talking of people that are well-read, that don't have the perverse incentives of keeping subsidies that are not needed, etc. So the first thing that I can say to the question is, one, again, it's a question of not black or white, but what is worse and what is best. The worst, absolutely, in terms of redistribution, is to give the power of redistribution to the ones that don't suffer from the misallocation of capital, okay? So at least the closer you get to achieving that redistribution through the process of free will and free decision between economic agents, the better. Will there be mistakes? Absolutely there will. Absolutely there will. What I can guarantee you is that the difference is that the mistakes in one part of the system will be severely larger and much more and longer lasting in terms of poverty and misery if you put it all in the hands of government. Because again, it's this idea that people are greedy and governments are generous. Makes no sense.
Yes, it is extraordinary, isn't it? It's extraordinary that this belief that as soon as you take a civil servant's salary, you cease to be greedy. And you're miraculously transformed into a wise, disinterested, generous and altruistic person, or whatever, simply by taking the money from everybody else. I'm going to put in another question. Actually, let me just say we've already got probably more questions than we're going to be able to get through. We've got a lot both from YouTube and from Zoom, but do upvote if there's one that you would like me to put. Here's one that I think is interesting because it's from a different angle, from somebody called Louis van Boxel Wolf. Can you hear me, Daniel? Yep. Hello, self-described leftist here. I note so far that you've both made a materialist argument. GDP matters insofar as it means health, welfare, markets, spread more prosperity, etc. What would you say to a more philosophical, some might say soft critique, to people who say, okay, sure, free markets give a lot of people stuff they want at a price they want, but that's not the only thing that matters. Sense of belonging, sense of stability, sense of pride in difficult and dangerous works, as opposed to tapping a keyboard, that all matters as well. What would we say to that critique? Hang on, we've lost the sound again. Just one moment. Yep, can you?
I was muted.
Got it.
I was for a second. All of those things do matter. Absolutely, they do. But you don't achieve any of them without the economic benefit first. When this idea that you can achieve a level of equality or a level of growth or a level of well-being that is apart from economic growth makes no sense. There is no freedom without economic freedom. That's why it's the pillar that sets society. And in every single society, you have to see first an improvement in economic growth for the society, then to think of other more philosophical issues. And you're not going to achieve them by making everyone poor or by redistributing nothing. Again, coming back to the point, think about any society. You don't think about, go to Cuba today, go to North Korea. Those people are not thinking about their philosophical well-being. They're thinking about getting some food on the table. And that is the first and foremost measure of social well-being. It's economic, and if you don't start with that, all of the rest disappears.
It's a sort of hierarchy of needs, isn't it? It's only when you have you don't need to worry about food, shelter, clothing, and so on, that you have time to do these other things. I think we've lost your.
Again, it tends to mute me for no reason. Absolutely, again. We think of, when most of our esteemed colleagues in the left start from the idea that nothing can get any worse and that everything that we have achieved is a given. That is wrong. That is completely wrong. That is why the idea that we've achieved enough wealth in the world and what we need to do now is redistribute is nonsensical. It's the opposite.
Yes, it's also, by the way, though, it's a very old idea. Yeah. I can't think of any period in history when people have not made exactly that argument. You know, yeah. The Victorians made it, the Georgians, the Romans, at least back to the time of Seneca, people have said, oh, we're better off than we've been in the past, but we've lost the important things. What about faith and sacrifice and friends and family and da-da-da? And every generation thinks that it's up to them to say we've reached saturation point.
Yeah,
but our grandchildren will regard as necessities what we regard as luxuries. Yet we assume, like every previous generation, that we're the ones who have reached the end point, and Absolutely. Therefore the ones who say we don't need any more growth, which is, I suppose, understandable, but rather solipsistic. Now, I'm going to try and gather together a number of people. Daniel, have asked you about your views on the euro, the impact on monetary union of this crisis, the German Supreme Court declaring itself sovereign over the ECB, how people are responding in Spain. Give us your thoughts generally about monetary union and what's likely to emerge on the other side of this crisis.
Yes, right now, the support of the euro in the vast majority of European countries, of Eurozone countries, is very high. And the reason why it's very high is because of history. As a Spaniard or as an Italian, you remember, if you're a little bit older than I am, you remember the disaster of monetary policy that was implemented by having their own central bank and their own currency. The reality for many is that if Spain or Italy or Portugal decided to have their own free floating currency, we would be more close to Argentina than to the UK. And why? Because monetary policy in itself is not the solution. The reason why the UK has a strong currency and a strong monetary system, and at the same time a strong level of investment and appetite to invest in that currency, is because of the independence and the stability of institutions and the defense at all cost of private property and the defense of investor security. If you leave the euro, in which you basically buying or the stability generated by the Germans, particularly, to be fairly honest, and then you substitute that with no investor security, no legal security, and no independent institutions, what you end up is with a currency that would absolutely collapse and massive impoverishment.
Let me put a point to you that, or a suggestion to you, that if the coronavirus if it were a conscious entity and it had been expressly trying to attack the euro, it would have hit at Italy, and specifically at the industrial northern heartland of Italy.
Yeah,
I mean, you could paradoxically make the argument that had the impact of the coronavirus economically been more severe in Germany and the Netherlands than in Spain and Italy, that would have actually helped the euro. That would have helped to even out some of the imbalances.
Yeah.
But by striking hardest at Spain and Italy and relatively mildly at Germany and the Netherlands, there is an argument that it has made the imbalances worse. Fair?
Yes, but simply because the system has been created as a system of perverse incentives, not because of the euro. The problem in Italy and Spain is not the euro. The problem in Italy and Spain is massive government spending, well above its means. That Holland doesn't have a problem with the euro. And the idea that Spain or Italy would be better off with their own currency only comes from the idea that every 10 years or every 5 years, actually, they would destroy the real salaries and wages of their citizens with a 20% competitive devaluation, which is, by the way, what they did for decades. I'm going to try to charge my phone because it's not charging. So while you ask the question, I'm going to mute myself. Okay.
Okay. Right. Well, while you're let me ask a question while you're doing that. Both of us live in countries where the government has locked down. The British and Spanish governments have prohibited a lot of activity, a lot of economic, social, cultural life that was previously okay. The difference is that we have a conservative government and you have quite a left government, a Podemos, PSOE coalition of sorts. And yet I'm struck by the fact that whereas the British left, understandably in a way, has said the lockdown should have come earlier, we should be careful about releasing it, we need to be more careful. In Spain, the same criticism has come from the right. And I just wonder whether, is that because Spain is more statist and dirigist in its tradition, or is it just that we are all automatically partisan, tribal creatures, and therefore people will begin by whether or not they like the government?
Yes, I think that to start with, I will say that the center-right in Spain is significantly more statist than in other countries, and that there is, remember that Spain and Italy are societies that were not built from the bottom up, from civil society to government. That government was not created, these societies were created almost top down. Okay, it's an important factor, not something to criticize, but the Anglo-Saxon societies, the UK, the United States, were not built from the privileges of the state to generate some benefits to the people, but by the people to give some power to administrations in order to serve them. It's different. It is different. And that's what makes it very, very challenging in our case, no? That there's this general feeling that it's the state who gives you social security, not taxpayers, that it's the state who gives you well-being, not companies and the interaction of people. It's true that all of that also is challenged in the process that we're living right now. But it comes fundamentally from a history of thinking that the government is some sort of, Father Christmas.
A couple of viewers have asked your views about universal basic income. I don't know if you, I mean, some countries have got a lot closer to it. A lot of countries are employing the vast majority of the population now, one way or another. What can we see of this massive global experiment?
Well, universal basic income is a great tool for slavery. It's a great, think about it. Universal basic income is something that is going to be paid by governments in a currency that is going to be constantly devalued, and that is a subsidy to obedience. Ultimately, universal basic income is not universal. This is important. It's in wealthy countries at the expense of the savings, at best, of emerging countries. Second, it's not basic because it is constantly devalued through the destruction of the purchasing power of the currency. And third, it's not income, it's a subsidy. And it's a tremendous disincentive to work. It's a tremendous, and the key of why the universal basic income doesn't work is when you speak with the people that defend it, why are they against a negative tax?
Yeah, okay.
You see, that in itself explains it all.
Let me ask you the final question from our, and I apologize now to all the people who I haven't had time to get around to, but we've had a lot of questions in. But a couple of people have asked about China. Yeah. I mean, we face the very real prospect after this of a crisis, maybe even a full-scale trade war between the world's largest and second largest economies. I think there's a lot more suspicion of China in the West than there was 3 months ago. At the same time, we can see that China has come out of the crisis earlier and stronger than most Western countries. How is the world going to be different, and how should we respond? Should we be seeking to make China's success part of ours, or should we be wary of a statist and authoritarian regime?
Well, both. We need to avoid protectionism at all costs, because protectionism, it only protects the government and it's going to harm more than it improves. But we cannot have a system that allows China to continue to maintain its closed economy, capital controls, no respect for intellectual property, no respect for legal security, and because then we're not playing with the same cards in this game. So I think that, yes, we need to open more, but we need to open more from fair trade, from better bilateral agreements.
Okay, we're getting close to the end of our time, but I do want to ask you one thing. And from an, for me, unwontedly pessimistic perspective, I normally am fairly cheerful about public affairs, but it's difficult not to be gloomy about where we are now. How do we get out of this? How, from a starting point that values private property, personal autonomy, and free contract, can we claw our way out of the slough in which we find ourselves? And I don't just mean by that we are dealing with unprecedented rises in spending, nor do I mean only that we have seen a huge increase in the coercive powers of governments. I mean that there's been a change in public attitudes, that because people panic in a situation like this. And because they look upwards for help, and they become intolerant of people who they think are dissenting, the whole climate becomes much more statist, much more authoritarian, much more illiberal. And I'll draw a parallel. I mean, one has to be careful of doing this too much, but I think I can draw an exact parallel in one sense with what happened, at least in the UK, after the Second World War. In 1945, as now, we had amassed immense debts. We didn't pay off our last installment to the US until 2006. And in 1945, of course, we'd had a mobilization which had meant a huge expansion in the power of the government. And what we found is that it became very, very difficult to get those powers back again once the emergency had passed. So food rationing remained until 1954. Identity cards remained until 1952. Military conscription remained until 1960. All of these powers that had been supposedly assumed on a contingent and temporary basis were then retained. And indeed, when it came to the field of economics, in some cases, they were never returned. Certainly not until the Thatcher era. And I would argue in the way we run our education and healthcare systems, we're still basically operating on a model that was put together during the command economy in the first half of the 1940s. So are we facing that kind of future? Are people like you and me going to find themselves irrelevant in the way that free market liberals did after 1945? Do we face decades of trying to make these arguments from first principles? Or can you give us some little hope or spark of optimism to look forward to?
I think that there is hope. And the reason why there is hope is because in 1945, the level of openness of capital markets did not exist. And capital markets and the importance of capital markets to get out of this crisis are going to prevent precisely that. The authoritarian desires of governments are going to be stopped precisely because governments will require in developed nations the savings of emerging markets and therefore the legal and investor security to accept those savings.
Very good. Okay, we have just slightly exceeded our time. So let me say a huge thank you to you, Daniel. And I would normally at this point say your book, Freedom or Equality, is available in all good bookshops. But of course, all good bookshops are closed by state diktat at the moment, but it is available on Amazon and by any other online delivery method. And thank you to you for giving up your time and sharing your thoughts with us. Thank you to everyone who's been watching on YouTube. Thanks to everyone who's been watching on Zoom. And let me now hand back to my friend, the great Mark Littlewood.
Thank you very much.
Both Daniels, thank you very much indeed. As Dan H says, thanks to our audience. Just to remind you to keep up to date with all of the IEA's digital content, please visit our YouTube channel, IEA London. Some of you would have been watching on that, and please hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. We are posting in chat how you can buy Daniel's book and a link to his website as well. Our next live stream, I am hosting at 6 o'clock tomorrow evening on YouTube. I have a whole plethora of free market liberal guests to continue the argument and the discussion about how we emerge from this crisis and disaster.